Ahoy! Hello. I've been reading Dark Star Rising, Magic and Power in the Age of Trump by Gary Lachman. Very good book. I'm going to have the opportunity to speak with Gary in December at an event at the October Gallery in London. In his text, he's exploring quite a lot about this notion of fake news and the manipulation of truth and falsity in Trump's campaign and within Russia and generally within the kind of political scene. So there's a lot of ideas I'd like to unpack from that, but I'm going to save that for December. It did, however, make me think quite a lot about this idea of truth and falsehood. And in Magick, it is definitely the case, perhaps true to say, that there's an interesting kind of relationship between these concepts. Because something that could be not true, not the case, can still be something which enables a process to unfold which leads to a truth. There are many, many, many examples of this. I'll just give a few to give you kind of a flavour of what I'm talking about here. So there's a couple that I thought of in relation to prophecy. I went to see a film when it came out in 2012 called When the Iron Bird Flies. A very beautiful movie about the story of how Tibetan Buddhism has come to particularly North America. And the title is taken from a prophecy made by Padmasambhava, his Tibetan sage from about the 8th century, I think, who said, "When the iron bird flies and horses run on wheels, then will the Dharma come to the land of the red faces." And obviously this has been taken to mean it was a prophecy of the Chinese invasion, the diaspora of Tibetan people and Tibetan Buddhist practice, and its emergence in North America. Thing is, there is no prophecy in Tibetan texts, and all of those phrases, although they do appear, are interpretable in other ways that make more sense within the cultural context. So there isn't a prophecy about iron birds flying and horses running on wheels and essentially North America. It just doesn't exist. Nevertheless, certainly in terms of the film that I saw, and certainly in terms of the understanding that people have of the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha coming to North America, this prophecy makes sense and it's supportive of that. Sometimes fake prophecies do even more than this. So if we take the example of the prophecy of the Rainbow Warriors, this is imagined to be a Native American prophecy, and it's a text which in its various forms runs along the lines of when the earth is dying and all the animals are being destroyed, then a group of people will come along with all different races and colours and religions, and they will form together and they'll form a tribe, and they will save the earth, and these people will be called the Rainbow Warriors. The thing is that the text that this originally comes from is actually a text which was being used to evangelize Native American people. And various Native American groups have come out and said, the whole idea of this being a prophecy is absurd and it's offensive and so on. It's also the case that this fake prophecy inspired the founders of Greenpeace, which is why the real boats that really went out and really stopped whales from being killed were called Rainbow Warrior. So there's an example of how two things which are fake can inspire people sometimes to very, very direct and practical action. So the Rainbow Warrior prophecy fed into that whole kind of emerging 1970s ecological consciousness and led to people actually doing stuff which I think in many respects was highly beneficial. We can think in more kind of magical terms as well if we think of the way that the Romantic movement looked back in history and found inspirational figures from an imagined pre-Christian past. There are many instances of this. One of perhaps the most obvious is the emergence of witchcraft. So if we look at people who are considering witchcraft and in reimagining witchcraft, people like Michelet, and later on people like Margaret Murray, what these people are doing is they're imagining not just cunning folk and sorcerers, but they're imagining a whole underground religion, a religion of perhaps horned gods or of earth goddesses that has survived from pagan times. Now this is almost certainly not true. in the sense that there is no practical lineage. And this, of course, this idea was dismantled very, very successfully by Ronald Hutton in his book Triumph of the Moon. So the idea that the old religion, Wicca, or some other variant of this, was actually a religious belief which had persisted from the dawn of Christianity through the medieval into the early modern and then emerged in the modern day, that's just not the case. However, it has to be said that the imagined witch cult inspired all kinds of people and ultimately led to the existence of real card-carrying witches. The same can be said of Druidry. So the same thing. People are looking back in history and they're looking for who are these inspirational figures from pre-Christian times? What can we recover? What can we reimagine? With Druidry, the story is really interesting because you've got a guy, Iolo Morgannwg, who fakes a whole bunch of ancient Druid texts, passes them off as legitimate material, and that feeds into the emerging Druidry movement of the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. And that leads to real Druids, real people who are really kind of doing their practice. So something that's not true, or rather more accurately something that I guess what Robert Graves would call a poetic truth, can have very much power and action in the world. We can see this on a microcosmic scale in as much as we have the power of placebo. Placebo, which is a kind of throwaway term, is clearly a magical effect. That is to say, it's an effect which is predicated on imagination, not just the imagination of that person, but the cultural milieu that they inhabit. And it allows verifiable healing to take place without there being any clear causal relation to perhaps a medicine that's given. We know that in terms of the fakery of placebo, that placebo pills are different strengths depending on their colour, and that placebo injection or placebo operations, placebo surgery, are the most powerful forms of placebo. Now these are perhaps fake in the same way that one might say that psychic surgery is fake or shamanic healing is fake, but nevertheless the healing that occurs is undoubtedly real. This is partly based on the idea that when people heal themselves, they always heal themselves. A doctor might patch you up and might give you some medicine, but it's ultimately you in your body that does the work. So it puts the emphasis on that and attempts to manipulate and change that so that we get the outcome that we want. Carlos Castaneda, there's another example. Loads of the material, probably completely made up. Nevertheless, it inspires all kinds of people, including those who would now identify as very sort of traditional shaman. It inspired those people to go out and discover their style and to discover a lineage that they could kind of lock into. And it made a lot of the indigenous practitioners make more sense to the West. We could understand that thing a lot better. So it was a translation mechanism as well. This idea of truth and falsity is an interesting one, and I think that it's always been the case. It's always been the case. We also have mechanisms for exploring and addressing that. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One, for instance, is that I was working in a gallery recently with a group of young people, and there were some yo-yos, and they were playing with the yo-yos. And I said, I don't know if it's true, but I've heard that yo-yos were originally weapons in ancient China. And then I thought about this, and I thought, well, I've heard this, but I don't know that that's actually the case. So I went off and I had a little look, and turns out that yo-yos, or more accurately what I would describe as a Diablo, was used in ancient China. But the modern yo-yo is basically a 1930s invention, and the story was put round, basically to make them sound more exciting, that these were weapons. It's also one of those kind of sort of slightly jokey things, how could a yo-yo be a weapon? And also, of course, it would be a great weapon, returns to kind of like a boomerang style. But what I was able to do is I was able to go to the internet and I was able to have a look, and I was importantly able to have a look at a whole bunch of sources in order to track the story. Now, of course, one should still be mindful that I'm going through ultimately a data set and I have my own prejudices and my own bits of misinformation knocking around in my head, which obviously influence kind of how I look at this. But I would suggest that actually these days we're probably in a better position to establish the truth or falsity, if we want to use those terms, of an idea, if we learn how to sort and search and select our data well. The other thing, I guess, is about embracing that which is false in order to get somewhere else. So St Nexton's Glen recently, which is a place that I run retreats with my partner Nikki Weird, beautiful place in Cornwall. I saw a fantastic video that went onto Facebook, which was someone who had gone to the Glen. So this is a deeply wooded valley, a large waterfall that comes down into a big pool of water. They'd gone down into the keeve, as we call it, the cup, into where the water falls, and they'd reached in and they'd found a magic crystal. And they were of the opinion that this was a Lemurian seed crystal, which would open a fairy portal between the White Spring in Glastonbury and St Nexton's Glen. Now, there's various ways of dealing with that. You can kind of go, oh, these people are complete airheads, whatever. It makes no odds. It's also possible to engage with this as one might with any story and say, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder what that means. I wonder what that means. You know, what does that mean for these people? What does that mean for these places? What does that mean for the kind of relationships involved in this story? So rather than simply saying it's not true, to explore the poetic truth of that and where that might get us. And a lot of magic is about that. A lot of magic is about this idea of as if, behaving as if this were the case. So I'm feeling really sad and feeling really down, so I behave as if I'm really happy. And that process makes me happier. So the relationship of truth and falsity in magic is, like a lot of things, a lot more slippery, a lot more complicated, and a lot more subtle than good or bad, true or false, left or right. Thank you for listening.